Where the lush jungle surrenders to the tranquil beach, a sea dog finds itself ensnared in a cruel fishing net. Struggling against the unforgiving mesh, the sea dog whimpers softly, its distress echoing in the otherwise serene landscape. The atmosphere is thick with tension as the helpless creature fights for freedom. In the heart of the jungle, a massive lion emerges, drawn by a desperate cry, his gaze piercing through the dense foliage. The lion evaluates the scene, a flicker of concern deepening his eyes, capturing the audience's attention. With cautious steps, the lion advances toward the net, his every move filled with the weight of responsibility and determination. At the jungle's edge, a lion, with focused determination, begins to meticulously tear through a fishing net, offering a glimmer of hope to an awaiting dog. Each precise movement of the lion's claws heightens the tension, as the sound of the net tearing fills the air with anticipation and promise. The dog's hopeful anticipation intensifies with each strand severed as freedom draws nearer. Against the serene backdrop of the beach, a lion's courageous act sets a dog free, sparking an unlikely bond. Gratitude shines in the sea dog's eyes as it gazes up at its liberator, the mighty lion. The lion, now a guardian, exudes tenderness as it watches over the dog, symbolizing a friendship born from bravery.